The village of Little Wickham had arranged itself for the annual summer fete with all the careful precision of a well-rehearsed theatrical performance. The rectory lawn, bordered by hollyhocks and sweet peas that nodded approvingly in the gentle July breeze, had been transformed into a charming tableau of white canvas stalls, bunting that fluttered like prayer flags, and small tables groaning beneath the weight of Victoria sponges and cucumber sandwiches cut with mathematical exactitude. Miss Jane Marple, who had come over from St. Mary Mead at the invitation of her old school friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, sat contentedly beneath the spreading branches of an ancient elm. Her knitting bag rested beside her chair, and her needles moved with the steady rhythm of someone for whom the creation of beauty was as natural as breathing. She was working on what appeared to be a delicate christening shawl in palest cream wool, though she had mentioned to no one the purpose of her project. "Such a lovely turnout this year," murmured Mrs. Bantry, settling beside her friend with a cup of tea that bore the unmistakable signs of having been poured by the vicar's wife, slightly too strong and accompanied by a biscuit that had seen better days. "Though I must confess, Jane, there's rather more tension in the air than one might expect at a church fete." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, mild but remarkably observant, glanced up from her work. "Oh, my dear Dolly, I've found that wherever you gather a dozen or more people together, particularly in a small community, there are bound to be undercurrents. Rather like knitting, actually. The pattern on the surface may appear quite simple, but underneath there's often a great deal of complexity." The focal point of much of the afternoon's activity, and indeed its underlying tension, was the handicraft stall presided over by Mrs. Esme Weatherby. A woman of considerable presence and equally considerable opinions, Mrs. Weatherby had been the undisputed authority on all matters domestic in Little Wickham for the better part of 2 decades. Her own entry in the knitting competition, an elaborate Aran cardigan that had taken her the better part of 6 months to complete, sat displayed in a handsome wicker basket lined with pale blue silk, surrounded by skeins of the finest wool, and an array of silver needles that caught the afternoon light like tiny swords. "I do hope," Mrs. Weatherby was saying in her carrying voice to Mrs. Fletcher, the baker's wife, "that this year's judging will be conducted with rather more attention to proper technique than last year's unfortunate oversight." The words were spoken with the kind of smile that suggested anything but warmth, and Mrs. Fletcher's response, a tight nod and a murmured, "Of course, Mrs. Weatherby," indicated that some previous grievance remained unresolved. Miss Marple noticed other tensions as well. Young Sandra Mills, the village librarian, stood near the bookstall with her shoulders held rather too rigidly, her gaze occasionally drifting toward Mrs. Weatherby with an expression that suggested recent unpleasantness. Mr. Geoffrey Sims, recently retired from the bank and still adjusting to village life, hovered uncertainly near the handicraft display. His attempt to examine the knitted goods met with a distinctly cool reception from their creator. The moment for the announcement of the competition results had arrived, drawing a small but expectant crowd around Mrs. Weatherby's domain. The Reverend Arthur Clement, a gentle soul whose sermons were notable more for their kindness than their theological rigor, stepped forward with a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice barely carrying over the general murmur of conversation, "it gives me great pleasure to announce the winner of this year's needlework competition." But the words died on his lips as Mrs. Weatherby, who had been arranging her display with characteristic precision, suddenly straightened with a sharp intake of breath. Her hand flew to her throat. Her eyes widened in what appeared to be profound surprise rather than pain, and for a moment she swayed like a flower in a sudden gust of wind. "Mrs. Weatherby," the vicar called out in alarm, but she was already falling, collapsing gracefully among her carefully arranged skeins of wool. The beautiful wicker basket tipped as she fell, spilling its contents across the grass, balls of yarn rolling like scattered thoughts, silver needles glinting in the afternoon sun, and the prize cardigan settling gently over her still form like a shroud. The festive chatter died as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the jam entries with professional interest, pushed through the suddenly silent crowd and knelt beside the fallen woman. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he looked up, his expression told the assembled villagers everything they needed to know. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "that Mrs. Weatherby has passed away. It appears to have been quite sudden." Miss Marple, who had risen from her chair with the measured movements of someone who understood that haste rarely improved difficult situations, observed the scene with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern. She noticed how Mrs. Fletcher's initial gasp of shock had been followed by something that looked remarkably like relief. She saw young Sandra Mills press her hand to her mouth, though whether in genuine distress or to suppress some other emotion was difficult to determine. Most interesting of all, she observed that among the scattered contents of the knitting basket, the small silver scissors that had been so prominently displayed were nowhere to be seen. As the vicar called for someone to telephone the police, and the crowd began to mill about in that aimless way people do when confronted with the unexpected presence of death, Miss Marple quietly retrieved her knitting and settled it in her bag. In her long experience, she had learned that the moments immediately following such events often revealed more about human nature than years of ordinary observation. And something about this particular death, occurring as it had in such a public setting and at such a convenient moment, struck her as altogether too neat to be entirely natural. The afternoon sun continued to shine down on Little Wickham, but the shadow that had fallen across the summer fete would prove to be longer and darker than anyone yet suspected. The moments following Mrs. Weatherby's collapse unfolded with that peculiar mixture of confusion and instinctive organization that occurs when the ordinary rhythm of life is suddenly disrupted. Dr. Haydock remained kneeling beside the fallen woman, his professional demeanor masking what Miss Marple recognized as genuine perplexity. The vicar, still clutching the competition results in his pocket like a guilty secret, attempted to shepherd the crowd with gentle authority that convinced no one, least of all himself. Mrs. Bantry, displaying the take-charge instincts that had served her well through decades of village crises, began directing the nearer ladies toward the lemonade table with soothing murmurs about giving the doctor space to work. The crowd moved reluctantly, their natural curiosity warring with ingrained politeness, creating small eddies of whispered speculation that grew more animated with each passing moment. A young boy, perhaps 7 years old, and blissfully unaware of the gravity surrounding him, chased after a ball of soft gray yarn that had escaped from the overturned basket. He pounced upon it with triumph, and, seeing the serious faces of the adults, looked about uncertainly for someone safe to return it to. Miss Marple held out her hand with a gentle smile. "How very clever of you," she said warmly, and the boy, reassured, delivered his treasure before racing away like a bird released from captivity. As Miss Marple wound the yarn with practiced fingers, she noticed several interesting details that others had overlooked in their distress. The wool was cooler than the afternoon air and carried the faint scent of lavender, as befitted a woman of Mrs. Weatherby's particular standards. More intriguingly, caught among the gray strands were 2 or 3 fibers of a different hue, a paler thread rather like raw embroidery floss, and an infinitesimal dark speck that might have been nothing more than a mote from the lawn. She brushed it away carefully, not because it was unimportant, but because it was the sort of detail best remembered rather than announced. The arrival of Constable Pritchard, cycling up from the village with the determined air of a man unused to emergencies of this magnitude, provided a welcome focus for the crowd's nervous energy. He was followed shortly by Inspector Slack, whose brisk manner and skeptical expression suggested he had already formed preliminary conclusions about the afternoon's events. "Natural causes, I'd say," Inspector Slack announced after a brief consultation with Dr. Haydock, his tone suggesting the matter was essentially settled. Woman of her age, excitement of the competition, probably her heart. These things happen at village functions." He gestured dismissively at the scattered knitting materials. "We'll have the body removed and get everyone back to their festivities." Dr. Haydock's frown suggested he was not entirely satisfied with this assessment, but he merely nodded and began making arrangements for the removal of Mrs. Weatherby's remains. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself within earshot of this exchange, found the inspector's eagerness to close the matter rather premature, though she kept this observation to herself for the moment. The crowd had naturally arranged itself into small clusters, each developing its own theory about the sudden death. Near the jam stall, Mrs. Fletcher was holding forth to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying more satisfaction than genuine sorrow. "I always said she pushed herself too hard with all that perfectionist nonsense," she declared, warming to her theme, working late into the night over her knitting, fussing about every stitch. It's not natural for a woman her age to be so intense about everything. Young Sandra Mills stood apart from these groups with the isolated air of someone who knew she would inevitably become the subject of whispered conversations. The librarian was pale, her hands clasped tightly together, and she kept glancing toward the spot where Mrs. Weatherby had fallen, as if expecting the woman to rise and resume her criticisms. There was something in her expression, a mixture of fear and what might have been relief, that Miss Marple filed away for future consideration. "What exactly was this disagreement about the library?" Miss Marple asked Mrs. Bantry quietly, her tone suggesting nothing more than mild curiosity. "Oh, something about Sandra teaching knitting techniques that Esme considered inferior," Mrs. Bantry replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You know how particular she was about proper methods. Sandra had apparently been showing some of the younger women a simpler way to cast on stitches, and Esme took it as a personal affront to everything she stood for. There were quite heated words at the Women's Institute last Tuesday." Mr. Geoffrey Sims approached their table with the hesitant manner of someone seeking refuge from an uncomfortable situation. The retired banker settled into an empty chair without invitation, his face bearing the expression of a man who had endured one humiliation too many. "Terrible business," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Though I must confess, Mrs. Weatherby and I had our differences. She was not particularly welcoming to newcomers." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with polite interest. "Oh dear, that must have made settling into village life rather difficult." Sims's laugh held little humor. "She made it abundantly clear that my attempts to contribute were neither wanted nor appreciated. When I offered to help organize the handicraft displays, thinking my banking experience might be useful for the logistics, she informed me quite publicly that the arrangements had been perfectly adequate for 20 years without interference from outsiders." His face flushed at the memory. The woman had a remarkable talent for making one feel thoroughly unwelcome. Despite his obvious resentment, Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Sims kept glancing toward the overturned knitting basket with something that looked like genuine regret. It was curious how death could transform even the most difficult relationships into something more complex and ambiguous. As Inspector Slack began taking preliminary statements and the crowd slowly dispersed, Miss Marple made her way over to where the knitting basket still lay on its side, its contents now being gathered by one of the constables. She paused to examine the scattered items with the careful attention of someone who understood that domestic details often held the key to larger mysteries. The basket itself was of fine wicker, lined with pale blue silk that was clearly new. She could tell from the crispness of the fabric and the way the stitches had left faint indentations in the folds. Near the edge was a small pucker where the material had been taken up, and just beside it, almost invisible unless one knew what to look for, was a tiny nick in the wicker as if made by a sharp blade. The wool was of the finest quality, as one would expect from Mrs. Weatherby. The needles were silver-plated and well-maintained, but something was definitely missing from the collection, and Miss Marple was quite certain she knew what it was. The small silver scissors with the dove engraving that Mrs. Weatherby had displayed so prominently were nowhere to be found, as absent as if they had never existed at all. More significantly, Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Weatherby's final moments with the trained eye of someone who had witnessed many deaths, both natural and otherwise. The woman's hand had gone to her throat in a very specific gesture, not the clutching motion of someone experiencing cardiac distress, but the delicate touching of someone who had felt something unexpected there. And her expression in those final seconds had been one of surprise rather than pain, the look of someone who had suddenly understood something rather than someone overwhelmed by physical distress. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the fate's remaining activities took on the subdued character of a wake, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that very few people seemed genuinely grief-stricken by Mrs. Weatherby's death. The woman had been respected rather than loved, feared rather than cherished, and her sudden absence created more relief than sorrow among those who had known her best. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though it was still far from complete. Like any complex piece of knitting, it would require patience and careful attention to detail before its true design became clear. But Miss Marple had both qualities in abundance, and she was quite certain that before long the truth would reveal itself as clearly as dropped stitches in a poorly executed pattern. The missing scissors, the careful timing of the death, the various resentments and humiliations, all these elements would eventually weave themselves into a comprehensible whole. For now, it was enough to observe and remember, letting the suspects reveal themselves through their own words and actions, as they invariably did when they believed themselves safe from scrutiny. The evening that followed Mrs. Weatherby's sudden collapse brought with it the peculiar restlessness that settles over a village when death arrives unexpectedly at what should have been a celebration. Miss Marple, having accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to stay the night at Gossington Hall, found herself drawn into a series of conversations that revealed far more about the deceased woman's relationships than any formal investigation might have uncovered. Dr. Haydock arrived at the hall just as the evening light was fading, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of professional concern. "Damned peculiar business," he confided to Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry over a restorative brandy. "Inspector Slack is convinced it was natural causes, heart failure brought on by the excitement of the competition, but there are certain details that don't quite align with that conclusion." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the mild interest she always displayed when medical matters were discussed. "Oh dear, how troubling for you, Doctor. I imagine such uncertainties must be quite difficult to resolve." Haydock hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. There was a small mark on her throat, barely visible, really. Could have been anything, of course. An insect bite, perhaps, or a minor scratch. But the location was rather unusual, and there was a slight discoloration around it that suggested... He trailed off, seeming to realize he had perhaps revealed more than was strictly appropriate. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who appeared at the door in a state of considerable agitation. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope you don't mind my calling so late, but I simply had to speak with someone sensible about this dreadful business. Arthur is quite beside himself, and I'm afraid the police inspector seems more interested in closing the matter quickly than in understanding what really happened." Mrs. Bantry immediately invited her in, and over tea that was stronger than usual, Mrs. Clement began to unburden herself of the various tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of village life. "Poor Sandra Mills," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "She's been having such a difficult time lately, what with Mrs. Weatherby's constant criticisms. Just last week at the Women's Institute, Esme made quite a scene about Sandra's knitting instruction methods, suggesting in front of everyone that the poor girl was teaching the children incorrectly and potentially damaging their development." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her attention was entirely focused on Mrs. Clement's revelations. How very distressing for Miss Mills. I imagine such public corrections must have been deeply embarrassing. "Mortifying," Mrs. Clement agreed. "And it wasn't just the knitting. Mrs. Weatherby had taken exception to Sandra's choice of books for the library's modern fiction section, calling them unsuitable and threatening to complain to the parish council. The poor girl has been walking on eggshells for months. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Speaking of Miss Mills, I stopped by her cottage earlier this evening. Professional concern, you understand, as she looked rather shaken at the fate. But she wasn't at home. Mrs. Pemberton next door mentioned seeing her leave around 6 o'clock with what appeared to be an overnight bag. This information settled over the room like a chill. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment before resuming their rhythm, while Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Clement exchanged worried glances. The implications were obvious, though no one wished to voice them directly. The following morning brought Miss Marple the opportunity she had been quietly seeking. Under the pretext of visiting the high street shops, she made her way to Emma Pratt's establishment, a small but well-organized space filled with the tools and materials of the seamstress's trade. Miss Pratt, a thin woman with careful eyes and permanently pricked fingers, was eager to discuss her recent work for Mrs. Weatherby. "Oh yes, Miss Marple, I lined that basket just last Friday," she confirmed, producing a small notebook where she recorded her commissions. Mrs. Weatherby was most particular about the work. Said the old lining was grubby and not fit to be seen at the fete. She chose the silk herself, a very fine piece, not the shiny kind that some prefer. Paid cash and inspected the finished work on Monday with the greatest care. Miss Marple examined a sample of the pale blue silk with interest. Such lovely material. "Did Mrs. Weatherby bring the basket empty for you to work on?" "Oh yes, completely empty," Miss Pratt replied promptly. "Wouldn't dream of letting me near her precious woolen needles. She said my hands might snag the delicate fibers, though I always wear gloves for such work." She held up her kid-gloved hands with a mixture of pride and resignation. On her way back from the shops, Miss Marple encountered a small boy, the same child who had chased the escaped ball of wool the previous day. He approached her with the mixture of shyness and urgency that children display when they have important information to share but are uncertain of its reception. "Please, miss," he said, tugging at her sleeve. "I saw something yesterday, after the lady fell down. Something shiny went under the table, the one with the baby bonnets. A man's shoe knocked it there, and when I tried to get it, Mr. Sims told me to leave things alone." Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "How very observant of you, dear. Did you see what happened to the shiny thing after that?" The boy shook his head solemnly. "No, miss. But later, the lady with the blue gloves bent down near that table. She said she'd lost a pin when someone asked what she was looking for." This detail settled into Miss Marple's mind with the satisfaction of a piece fitting perfectly into a complex puzzle. Blue gloves at a village fete were either a small vanity or a small precaution, and given the circumstances, she was beginning to suspect the latter. Her final stop was at the rectory lawn, where Constable Pritchard was conducting a desultory search under the remaining tables. The ground showed clear marks where the various stalls had stood, and near the location of the baby bonnet table, Miss Marple noticed something that confirmed her growing suspicions. Caught in the short grass was a single pale thread, not wool, but something finer, like embroidery floss, that had been dragged rather than dropped. Inspector Slack arrived as she was making this observation, his manner suggesting he was eager to wrap up what he clearly considered a straightforward case. "No need to turn the place upside down," he announced with forced cheerfulness. "I've had another word with Miss Mills this morning, or rather, I've tried to. Seems she's gone to visit relatives in the next county. Left rather suddenly last evening, according to her neighbors." Miss Marple continued her examination of the grass without looking up. How thoughtful of her to remove herself from the village gossip. These situations can be quite overwhelming for sensitive young people. "Sensitive, perhaps," Slack replied with obvious skepticism. "Or guilty. She had motive, opportunity, and now she's fled. Doesn't take a detective to see the pattern there." As Inspector Slack departed, clearly satisfied with his theory, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that Sandra Mills's departure was almost too convenient, not just for the girl herself, but for someone else who might have counted on exactly this reaction from the most obvious suspect. The timing, coming so soon after the death and before any thorough investigation could begin, suggested either panic or careful calculation. The pattern was becoming clearer now, like a complex piece of knitting where the design gradually emerges from what initially appears to be random stitches. The missing scissors, the puncture wound that Dr. Haydock had observed, the pale thread caught in the grey wool, the woman with blue gloves, and now Sandra's convenient flight. All these elements were beginning to weave themselves into a comprehensible whole. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one, and that the truth usually lay hidden beneath layers of assumption and misdirection. Someone in Little Wickham was very clever indeed, and that someone was counting on Sandra Mills to bear the blame for a crime she had not committed. The challenge now would be to prove it before an innocent young woman's life was destroyed by circumstances she had not created. As the morning sun climbed higher over the village, Miss Marple made her way back to Gossington Hall, her mind already formulating the delicate test that would reveal the true nature of the person who had so carefully orchestrated Mrs. Weatherby's death. The killer had been patient and methodical, but they had also been human, and humans, in Miss Marple's long experience, always revealed themselves eventually through the very care they took to remain hidden. The morning after her discoveries brought Miss Marple to the village police station, where she found Constable Pritchard wrestling with paperwork, and the uncomfortable knowledge that Inspector Slack's hasty conclusions might not align with the facts emerging from his preliminary investigation. She arrived bearing a plate of Mrs. Bantry's seed cake, which she set down with the casual air of someone making a neighborly call rather than pursuing a murder inquiry. "Such a difficult time for everyone," Miss Marple observed gently, settling into the wooden chair across from Pritchard's desk. "I do hope Mrs. Weatherby's personal effects are being handled with proper care. Her family will want everything returned exactly as she left it, I'm sure." Pritchard, who had been dreading the prospect of explaining to Inspector Slack why certain evidence might need re-examination, gratefully produced the brown-wrapped bundle containing Mrs. Weatherby's knitting basket. "We've kept everything together, Miss Marple, just as you'd expect. Though I must say, looking at it all again this morning, there are some peculiarities I hadn't noticed yesterday." Miss Marple accepted the basket with reverent care, her fingers tracing the pale blue silk lining with the practiced touch of someone who understood fine needlework. What she discovered confirmed her growing suspicions. Along the inner curve where the silk met the wicker, 3 hasty stitches had been taken over what was clearly a recent repair. The silk puckered slightly, betraying work done in haste rather than with Mrs. Weatherby's usual precision, and a faint whitening on the wicker suggested recent pressure from something sharp. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, examining the repair more closely. "This lining was renewed only last Friday by Miss Pratt, yet here we have additional needlework that certainly wasn't part of the original job. Someone has opened this lining and sewn it closed again, rather clumsily, I'm afraid." Pritchard leaned forward with growing alarm. "You mean someone tampered with it? But when and why?" "I suspect," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "that Mrs. Weatherby used this hidden pocket to store something rather important, something that someone else wanted quite desperately." She rewrapped the basket carefully, her mind already moving to the next piece of the puzzle. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Geoffrey Sims, who appeared at the station door with the determined air of someone who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with his conscience. "Constable Pritchard, Miss Marple," he began formally. "I believe I have information that might be relevant to yesterday's tragedy." Over the next quarter hour, Sims provided a detailed account of his observations at the fete, paying particular attention to a woman in distinctive blue gloves who had been examining Mrs. Weatherby's knitting display with unusual intensity just minutes before the collapse. "She seemed to know exactly what she was looking for," he explained, his banker's eye for detail serving him well in recollection. When the vicar called for attention about the competition results, she moved away quite deliberately, melting into the crowd as if she didn't wish to be noticed. Miss Marple listened with the careful attention she always gave to eyewitness testimony, noting not just what was said, but how it was said. Mr. Sims's account had the ring of truth, and his obvious discomfort at coming forward suggested genuine civic duty rather than malicious gossip. The afternoon brought the weekly Women's Institute meeting, which Mrs. Bantry had suggested they attend, for the atmosphere, you understand, Jane. Nothing quite like a village meeting the day after a scandal for revealing true feelings. The Institute hall buzzed with subdued conversation, the usual competitive chatter replaced by hushed speculation and meaningful glances toward Mrs. Weatherby's conspicuously empty chair. During the tea interval, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Mrs. Davison, whose exquisite embroidery work had caught her attention the previous day. "Such beautiful threads you use," Miss Marple observed, examining the delicate pale strands that adorned Mrs. Davison's current project. "They're quite distinctive, not the sort one finds in ordinary shops, I imagine." Mrs. Davison beamed with pride. "Oh no, these are special order. Very fine quality, perfect for detailed work. I'm quite particular about my materials, as Mrs. Weatherby always appreciated." Her expression darkened slightly. She had such an eye for quality workmanship. Not everyone understood her standards, I'm afraid. Across the room, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Evelyn Cross methodically packing away a pair of bright blue gardening gloves, folding them with the precise care of someone who maintained her possessions in perfect condition. Mrs. Cross, she recalled, had been near the baby bonnet table during the confusion following Mrs. Weatherby's collapse, ostensibly helping with the clean-up, but perhaps accomplishing something rather different. The meeting's most revealing moment came during an overheard conversation between Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Gaskell about Sandra Mills's precipitous departure. Esme had been making that poor girl's life miserable for months, Mrs. Fletcher confided in lowered tones. All that business about the library books being unsuitable and her threats to report Sandra to the district council. She claimed to have evidence of Sandra's unsuitability for the position, though what sort of evidence one could gather about library management, I'm sure I don't know. This intelligence struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Mrs. Weatherby's penchant for collecting ammunition against those who displeased her suggested a woman who enjoyed wielding power through the threat of exposure. Such behavior inevitably created enemies, and enemies, in Miss Marple's experience, sometimes took desperate measures to protect themselves. The day's final revelation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Briggs, Mrs. Weatherby's devoted housekeeper, appeared at Gossington Hall that evening in a state of considerable distress. "I didn't know where else to turn," she confessed to Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry. "It's about a letter that's gone missing from Mrs. Weatherby's knitting basket. She told me specifically that if anything happened to her, I was to take this letter to the vicar immediately." Mrs. Briggs's hands trembled as she described the letter's contents. "It was about money, Miss Marple. Not her money, but someone else's. Something she'd discovered and meant to put right in her own fashion. You know how she was about moral standards. She couldn't bear the thought of dishonesty going unpunished." The picture was becoming clearer now, like a photograph developing in solution. Mrs. Weatherby had been blackmailing someone, not for money, but for the satisfaction of controlling their fate and dispensing justice according to her own rigid standards. The missing letter had contained evidence of this person's wrongdoing, and that person had taken desperate action to retrieve it before its contents could be revealed. Dr. Haydock's arrival with the preliminary autopsy results confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the method of murder. "The puncture wound was made by something very fine and sharp," he reported grimly. "Precisely placed to cause maximum effect with minimal visibility. The kind of wound that could only have been inflicted by someone with considerable knowledge of anatomy and experience with sharp instruments." As the pieces of the puzzle began to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind, She reflected on the peculiar nature of this crime. The killer had chosen their moment with careful calculation, using the confusion of a public event to cover their actions while simultaneously ensuring that an innocent person would bear suspicion. The blue gloves, the missing scissors, the tampered basket lining, the convenient timing of Sandra Mills's flight, all these elements spoke of a methodical mind that understood both human nature and the mechanics of misdirection. But such careful planning often contained the seeds of its own destruction. People who believed themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime invariably revealed themselves through their very confidence in their own superiority. Miss Marple had encountered such criminals before, and she knew that the key to exposing them lay not in dramatic confrontation, but in patient observation and the gentle application of psychological pressure. The trap she was beginning to formulate would require delicate handling, but she was confident that before another day passed, the truth would emerge as clearly as a pattern in well-executed needlework. The killer had made one crucial error in their otherwise careful plan. They had underestimated the power of human conscience and the inevitable tendency of secrets to reveal themselves when subjected to the proper sort of examination. Tomorrow would bring the test that would separate the guilty from the innocent, and Miss Marple was quite certain she knew exactly who would fail that test when the moment came. The morning that followed Mrs. Briggs's revelation dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to flatten both colour and mood alike. Miss Marple, after a quiet breakfast at Gossington Hall, walked to the rectory with the steady step of someone who meant to ask for nothing more than a few pastoral particulars, yet fully intended to listen for the tremors beneath the surface of ordinary speech. The vicar received her with palpable relief, though he tried to disguise it with the brisk attentions of a man busy with parish duties. "Mrs. Weatherby asked to see me yesterday afternoon after the prize-giving," he confessed, lowering his voice instinctively, though they were quite alone in his study. "She hinted at a matter of conscience, another's conscience, I gathered, not her own. She said she would bring what was necessary in her knitting basket, and that she hoped to prevent public scandal by allowing a graceful withdrawal." His face coloured slightly. She was not a gentle shepherd, Miss Marple, but she did prefer a certain order in the flock. Miss Marple nodded with understanding sympathy. "And the envelope never arrived, of course?" "No," he sighed heavily. "Nor was there anything at her house when Mrs. Briggs searched. Only a list of Women's Institute subscribers and a note in her hand. If I'm interrupted, the vicar will know what to do." "That is all we found." It was not all, Miss Marple thought, but she merely thanked him and continued her morning rounds. Her next stop was the library, where she found a solemn schoolgirl with braids manning the desk. "Miss Mills is away visiting her Aunt Ellen in Bexford," the child announced with the gravity of someone entrusted with official information. "She left on the 11:30 yesterday morning. She bought her ticket on Thursday when we went to the station to return a parcel." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Sandra Mills had purchased her ticket 2 days before Mrs. Weatherby's death, suggesting her departure was planned rather than a panicked flight. Someone had been counting on Sandra becoming the obvious suspect, and that someone had calculated correctly that the young woman's sensitive nature would drive her from the village at the first hint of scandal. At Emma Pratt's shop, Miss Marple learned that the seamstress had sold embroidery floss in pale cream to 2 customers recently. Mrs. Davison, who purchased the finest quality silk as was her custom, and Mrs. Cross, who had bought a cheaper variety the previous Saturday, claiming she needed a bit of mending silk to tidy a lining seam. The distinction between the 2 purchases was telling. Mrs. Davison's thread would have been used for her exquisite needlework, while Mrs. Cross's cheaper alternative suggested a more utilitarian purpose. Her most revealing visit, however, was to Mrs. Davison's cottage, where she found the accomplished needlewoman working in her sun-filled sitting room. The space was a testament to decades of dedicated craftsmanship, filled with frames, skeins of thread in every conceivable hue, and an array of delicate tools that spoke of serious artistry. Mrs. Davison welcomed her warmly, clearly pleased to have her work admired by someone who understood quality. As Mrs. Davison demonstrated a particularly intricate stitch, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small, elegant instrument lying beside the woman's thimble. It was a stiletto, a slender, sharply pointed tool used for piercing fabric to create eyelets or for delicate appliqué work. Its bone handle was worn smooth from years of use, and its tip, though tiny, was honed to surgical sharpness. Most significantly, Miss Marple noticed a minuscule nick just below the very tip, as if it had recently encountered something harder than fabric. "What an exquisite tool," Miss Marple remarked with innocent curiosity. "So delicate, yet so purposeful. I imagine it requires considerable skill to wield such an instrument with precision." Mrs. Davison's eyes brightened with professional pride. "Indeed it does. One must be extremely careful. A single slip could ruin hours of work, or worse, cause injury." She demonstrated the precise, almost surgical motion required, her hand steady and practiced. As she observed this demonstration, Miss Marple recalled a detail from the fete that had seemed insignificant at the time. Mrs. Weatherby had been wearing a small silver brooch shaped like a dove, pinned just beneath her throat where Dr. Haydock had later found the puncture wound. The brooch had a sturdy pin, and Mrs. Weatherby had been adjusting it moments before her collapse, as if it had been disturbed. The pattern was becoming clear now. Mrs. Weatherby, with her rigid standards and intolerance for deception, had discovered something about Mrs. Davison's work. Perhaps evidence of fraud, shortcuts taken, or designs stolen from other artisans. The missing letter had contained proof of this deception, something that would have destroyed Mrs. Davison's reputation as the village's premier needlewoman. At the fete, Mrs. Davison had approached the handicraft stall under the pretense of admiring Mrs. Weatherby's cardigan, but her true purpose was to retrieve the damning evidence from the basket's secret compartment. She had used her stiletto to carefully open the lining, but Mrs. Weatherby, ever vigilant about her possessions, had noticed the tampering. In the confrontation that followed, Mrs. Davison had struck with the precision of someone accustomed to working with sharp instruments, using the stiletto to inflict a wound that would appear natural, while Mrs. Weatherby adjusted her brooch. The embroidery threads caught in Mrs. Weatherby's wool. The missing scissors that had been planted to implicate Sandra Mills, the careful timing of the attack during the competition announcement. All these elements revealed a mind that understood both the mechanics of misdirection and the psychology of village gossip. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Davison for her time and made her way back to Gossington Hall, her understanding of the crime now complete. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, using her reputation for gentle artistry to mask a capacity for calculated violence. But like any complex piece of needlework, the pattern had flaws that became visible under careful examination, and Miss Marple was quite certain that when subjected to the proper sort of pressure, those flaws would reveal the truth as clearly as dropped stitches in a poorly executed design. The test she was planning would require delicate handling, but she had confidence that before another day passed, the real murderer would be exposed through their own carefully constructed deceptions. In her long experience, those who believed themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime invariably revealed themselves through the very care they took to remain hidden. The grey morning brought Inspector Slack to Gossington Hall with the satisfied air of a man who believed himself to be delivering the solution wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He accepted Mrs. Bantry's offer of coffee with the magnanimous gesture of someone bearing good news and announced that the missing silver scissors had been discovered in Sandra Mills's cottage, wrapped carefully in tissue paper and hidden in the back of a drawer. "Anonymous tip came in at dawn," he declared, settling his bulk into Mrs. Bantry's best chair. "Someone pushed a note under the station door with precise directions. Found them exactly where the note said they'd be, wrapped up neat as you please." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild interest. "How very convenient for your investigation, Inspector. Though I confess myself puzzled by one small detail, Did the tissue paper happen to carry any particular scent? Lavender, perhaps? Inspector Slack stared at her with the expression of a man who had not considered such refinements. Can't say I noticed any smell, Miss Marple. Evidence is evidence, regardless of how it smells. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Weatherby's house, where Mrs. Briggs received her with the grateful relief of someone who had been hoping for exactly such a visit. The housekeeper led her to Mrs. Weatherby's sitting room, a space that bore the unmistakable stamp of its late owner's exacting standards. "She sat right there yesterday morning," Mrs. Briggs confided, nodding toward the escritoire by the window, "writing with such determination as if she were setting the world to rights with her pen." Miss Marple approached the writing desk with the reverent care of someone examining a shrine. The heavy blotting pad still bore the ghostly impressions of recent correspondence, and she angled it carefully toward the light streaming through the lace curtains. Taking a scrap of thin paper and moistening it delicately with the tip of her finger, she pressed it gently against the blotted surface. Like a photograph developing in solution, faint words began to emerge. Artistic impropriety, stolen designs, evidence gathered for the good of our community standards. The revelation confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of Mrs. Weatherby's investigation. This had not been about financial irregularities or simple theft, but about something far more personal to the victim, the corruption of artistic integrity that she held sacred. By afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged what appeared to be an innocent tea party at Gossington Hall, ostensibly to discuss the disposition of the handicrafts left in Mrs. Bantry's care after the fate's disruption. She had specifically requested that Mrs. Davison attend, praising her exquisite taste and suggesting that her expertise would be invaluable in determining the proper care of the various pieces. Mrs. Davison arrived promptly, her appearance impeccable as always, though Miss Marple noticed a certain tension in her posture that suggested carefully controlled nerves. She had brought her own needlework bag, and within it Miss Marple glimpsed the familiar bone handle of the stiletto she had observed during her previous visit. As they settled around the tea table, Miss Marple had positioned her own modest knitting basket on the ottoman between them. Unlike Mrs. Weatherby's elaborate wicker creation, this was a simple affair lined with pale blue silk, a remnant that Miss Pratt had given her years ago. Tucked beneath the lining's edge was an envelope bearing what appeared to be Mrs. Weatherby's distinctive handwriting, though its contents were entirely innocent. "Such a terrible business about poor Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with steady hands. "Though I confess I've been thinking about something she said at the fete, about maintaining proper standards in artistic work. She was quite passionate on the subject, wasn't she, Mrs. Davison?" Mrs. Davison's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. Indeed, she was most particular about technique and authenticity, perhaps sometimes overly so. "Oh, but I think her concerns were quite justified," Miss Marple continued gently. "She mentioned having discovered some rather troubling examples of, shall we say, artistic borrowing, designs taken from other sources and presented as original work. She seemed to feel it was her duty to address such matters, regardless of the personal cost to those involved." The color drained from Mrs. Davison's face, but she maintained her composure with visible effort. Mrs. Weatherby could be quite unforgiving when she believed standards had been compromised. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And she had such an eye for detail. The smallest inconsistency in thread or technique would catch her attention immediately. Rather like a detective, really, piecing together evidence from the tiniest clues. She gestured toward her knitting basket. "Would you mind terribly moving that closer to the window, dear? The light is so much better there for examining delicate work." Mrs. Davison rose to comply, lifting the basket with her left hand, while her right fingers unconsciously traced the inner edge where the lining met the wicker. It was the gesture of someone familiar with hidden compartments, someone who had searched for concealed items before. Miss Marple observed this telling behavior with the satisfaction of an angler feeling the first tug on her line. Dr. Haydock's arrival that evening brought additional confirmation of her theories. "I've completed a more thorough examination of the wound," he reported, settling into his chair with the weary air of a man bearing unwelcome news. "The angle of entry suggests the weapon was wielded by someone left-handed, or by a right-handed person working from an awkward position behind the victim. The implement was extraordinarily fine and sharp, consistent with a stiletto or similar needlework tool." As the pieces of the puzzle arranged themselves in Miss Marple's mind, she reflected on the careful planning that had gone into Mrs. Weatherby's murder. The killer had chosen their moment with precision, using the confusion of the fate to mask their actions while simultaneously ensuring that Sandra Mills would appear to be the obvious suspect. The planted scissors, the girl's convenient flight, even the anonymous tip to the police. All these elements spoke of a methodical intelligence that understood both human psychology and the mechanics of criminal investigation. But such elaborate deceptions often contained the seeds of their own destruction. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that those who considered themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime invariably revealed themselves through their very confidence in their own superiority. Mrs. Davison's reaction to the carefully baited conversation had confirmed not only her guilt, but also her awareness that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. The final test would come tomorrow, when Miss Marple would arrange the delicate confrontation that would force the truth into the open. She was quite certain now that she understood both the crime and the criminal, and she was equally certain that justice, like a complex pattern in fine needlework, would soon reveal itself in all its terrible clarity. The evening settled over Little Wickham with the quiet satisfaction of a day's work well done, though few in the village suspected how much closer they had come to the resolution of their most disturbing mystery. In her room at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple prepared for what she knew would be the final act in this carefully orchestrated drama of deception and death. The grey morning that had followed Miss Marple's careful observations brought with it the sort of developments that seemed to confirm Inspector Slack's theories while actually undermining them entirely. She was taking her customary early walk through the village when Mrs. Briggs appeared at Mrs. Weatherby's garden gate, her face bearing the particular expression of distress that comes from discovering that grief has been compounded by violation. "Oh, Miss Marple," she called out with obvious relief at encountering someone sensible. "Such a dreadful thing has happened. Someone has been in Mrs. Weatherby's study during the night. Not a proper burglary, mind you, nothing obvious taken, no broken windows or forced doors, but her private papers have been disturbed, and the lock on her small mahogany box shows clear signs of tampering." Miss Marple examined the delicate scratches around the lock mechanism with the careful attention of someone who understood that the smallest details often revealed the largest truths. The marks were precise and clean, made by something very fine and sharp. Not the crude work of a common thief, but the careful application of a tool designed for delicate work. More significantly, caught on the rose bush beside the garden gate was a single strand of silver embroidery thread, so fine it was nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. The implications were immediately clear to Miss Marple, though she suspected they would be entirely lost on Inspector Slack. This was not the desperate flight of a guilty librarian, but the calculated desperation of someone who had realized that Mrs. Weatherby's meticulous record-keeping might contain evidence of artistic fraud that would destroy a carefully constructed reputation. The mahogany box, according to the vicar's earlier recollections, contained Mrs. Weatherby's matters of sensitive import, precisely the sort of documentation that would prove Mrs. Davison's plagiarism beyond any doubt. Her contemplation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Cross, who came hurrying down the lane with the determined air of someone who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with conscience and finally reached a decision. "Miss Marple, I simply must speak with you. I cannot bear this deception any longer, particularly now that poor Sandra Mills is being blamed for something she had nothing to do with." Over tea at Gossington Hall, Mrs. Cross unburdened herself of the full truth about the planted scissors. Her account was detailed and damning, revealing not only her own foolish complicity, but also Mrs. Davison's careful manipulation of village sympathies. She made it sound so reasonable, Mrs. Cross explained miserably. She said Sandra had borrowed the scissors and failed to return them, and that finding them in her cottage would simply restore them to their proper place while avoiding awkward questions. I was angry with Sandra's new methods, and Mrs. Davison seemed to be protecting the Institute's reputation. The confession confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected about the evening of the fete. Mrs. Davison had orchestrated not only the murder itself, but also the subsequent misdirection, using Mrs. Cross's minor resentments and natural deference to authority to ensure that the evidence would point away from the true killer. The blue gloves, the careful timing, the planted scissors, all these elements spoke of a mind that understood both human psychology and the mechanics of criminal investigation. By afternoon, word of Mrs. Cross's confession had spread through the village with the speed peculiar to small communities, creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation that drew the principal players together as inevitably as iron filings to a magnet. The Women's Institute had arranged an emergency meeting, ostensibly to discuss Mrs. Weatherby's memorial arrangements, but everyone understood that the real purpose was to address the growing uncertainty about recent events. Mrs. Davison arrived at the Institute Hall with her usual composure, though Miss Marple noticed the subtle signs of strain that suggested carefully controlled anxiety. Her needlework bag was positioned protectively at her side, and her fingers occasionally traced its edge with the unconscious gesture of someone ensuring that important items remained secure. Most tellingly, she wore a high-necked blouse that concealed the base of her throat, as if protecting herself from the sort of wound she had inflicted on her victim. During the preliminary discussions about memorial flowers and service arrangements, Miss Marple made her own contribution to the proceedings. She had brought with her a small collection of Mrs. Weatherby's needlework patterns, ostensibly donated by Mrs. Briggs for the memorial display. As she arranged them on the table, she made casual observations about their exceptional quality and originality, noting particularly the meticulous documentation that accompanied each design. Mrs. Weatherby was quite the scholar, Miss Marple remarked gently, holding up a pattern sheet covered with careful notations about historical provenance and technical variations. She took such pride in tracing the authentic origins of traditional designs. I believe she was preparing a paper on the subject, something about distinguishing genuine folk patterns from modern adaptations that had been incorrectly attributed to historical sources. The effect of these words on Mrs. Davison was subtle but unmistakable. Her hand tightened on her needlework bag, and for just a moment her carefully maintained composure wavered. Miss Marple continued her examination of the patterns, making increasingly specific observations about Mrs. Weatherby's research methods and her particular interest in exposing artistic fraud within the needlework community. She mentioned having discovered several cases of modern designs being presented as family heirlooms. Miss Marple continued conversationally. Apparently, she had gathered quite substantial documentation about these deceptions, including correspondence with other scholars and detailed analysis of stitch techniques that revealed their true modern origins. The trap was now fully set, baited with the one thing that Mrs. Davison could not ignore: the threat of exposure for the artistic fraud that had built her reputation. Miss Marple had not accused anyone directly, but she had made it clear that Mrs. Weatherby's research would eventually come to light, and that when it did, certain reputations built on borrowed designs and fabricated provenance would crumble entirely. As the meeting concluded and the ladies began to disperse, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Davison's careful attention to the pattern sheets, her eyes scanning them with the desperate intensity of someone searching for evidence of her own downfall. The silver thread caught on the rose bush, the tampered lock, the planted scissors, and now this barely controlled panic. All the elements were falling into place with the precision of a well-executed pattern. The final confrontation was now inevitable. Mrs. Davison's careful facade was beginning to crack under the pressure of accumulated evidence and psychological manipulation. Tomorrow would bring the moment when all pretense would be stripped away, and the true design of this deadly deception would finally be revealed in all its calculated cruelty. Miss Marple gathered her materials with the satisfaction of someone whose patient work was nearing completion. Like any complex piece of needlework, this mystery had required careful attention to detail and the gradual revelation of its underlying pattern. Now, with all the threads in place, it remained only to pull them tight and expose the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of misdirection and manufactured evidence. The evening that followed the Women's Institute meeting settled over Little Wickham with the deceptive calm that often precedes a storm. Miss Marple, who had returned to Gossington Hall with the satisfied air of someone whose careful preparations were bearing fruit, took the precaution of leaving her knitting basket in plain view on the morning-room writing table. The basket contained what appeared to be Mrs. Weatherby's familiar pale blue silk lining, and tucked beneath its edge was an envelope bearing the deceased woman's distinctive handwriting, though its contents were nothing more incriminating than Miss Marple's own grocery list, carefully penned in a passable imitation of Mrs. Weatherby's script. She slept lightly that night, as elderly people often do, and when the faintest scuff of leather against polished floorboards drifted up from below, she smiled into the darkness with the sad certainty of someone whose expectations had been met exactly. By morning, the evidence of nocturnal visitation presented itself with the neat precision of domestic disturbances that wished to remain unnoticed. The French windows showed fresh scratches around the latch, and a translucent filament clung to the writing table's edge. A hair-fine strand of waxed thread such as needlewomen draw through beeswax to strengthen it for delicate work. The decoy envelope had vanished, confirming that someone's desperation had overcome their caution. Miss Marple lifted the thread delicately on a pin and placed it on a saucer, saying nothing to Mrs. Bantry about the night's visitor until Inspector Slack arrived with his usual bluster and immediately concluded that Sandra Mills had returned under cover of darkness to retrieve damaging evidence. The morning brought an unexpected complication that served to muddy waters which had seemed to be clearing. The vicar arrived with a misdirected letter from Mrs. Weatherby, written the previous week and forwarded at last from the diocesan office. The letter contained a typed memorandum addressing two distinct concerns. The first, couched in familiar language about artistic impropriety and borrowed designs misrepresented as family patterns, was the business Miss Marple knew had led to murder. The second, more briefly noted, mentioned a temporary irregularity in Institute subscription funds, apparently a private loan by Mr. Geoffrey Sims, assured as to prompt repayment, but morally unfortunate. Inspector Slack seized upon this revelation with the enthusiasm of a man who preferred his suspects obvious and his motives simple. Mr. Sims, summoned immediately, arrived with the pallor of parchment and admitted to his transgression with exhausted sincerity. He had used a small portion of the Institute fund to cover a delayed dividend. For 48 hours only, Miss Marple, a foolish lapse, and had already replaced it on Friday morning, producing the bank receipt with trembling fingers. Mrs. Weatherby had discovered the matter and demanded contrition rather than publicity, and he had been prepared to beg the lady's pardon at the next meeting. Miss Marple observed this confession with the careful attention she gave to all human revelations, noting that Mr. Sims's shame sat upon him like an ill-fitting coat. He could be weak and foolish, certainly, but in her experience, men who killed by stealth with delicate precision did not possess his particular combination of transparency and moral cowardice. Their hands remembered exactness even when unoccupied, and their pride, when wounded, did not hang its head in shame. It struck with calculated fury. As if to emphasize the wrong conclusion, fate provided another flourish. Emma Pratt sent a boy with a bill and a curious message about a lady who had called late the previous evening for the finest crewel needles and beeswax, claiming she had a lining to repair in haste. The customer had worn a veil and paid in cash, refusing to leave her name. Inspector Slack interpreted this as further proof of Sandra Mills's guilt, failing to consider which village ladies would require needles so fine they needed beeswax to strengthen the thread, or which would wear a veil in Little Wickham where such affectation drew more notice than a torchlight procession. By afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged what appeared to be an innocent review of Mrs. Weatherby's needlework collection, ostensibly to organize a memorial display. She had specifically invited Mrs. Davison, praising her expertise and suggesting her guidance would be invaluable in properly cataloguing the deceased woman's extensive research materials. Mrs. Davison arrived with her usual composure, though Miss Marple noticed a certain tension in her posture that suggested carefully controlled nerves. As they examined Mrs. Weatherby's meticulously documented patterns, Miss Marple made casual observations about the deceased woman's scholarly approach to needlework authentication. "She was quite the detective, really," she remarked gently, holding up a pattern sheet covered with careful notations. "Such attention to tracing the authentic origins of traditional designs." She mentioned having discovered several cases where modern work had been presented as historical family pieces, complete with fabricated provenance. Mrs. Davison's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. Esme could be quite thorough in her investigations. "Oh yes, remarkably so," Miss Marple continued with innocent enthusiasm. She had been corresponding with collectors and museum curators, gathering photographic evidence of artistic fraud within the needlework community. Mrs. Briggs mentioned that she was preparing a comprehensive article, perhaps even a book, that would expose such deceptions. She seemed particularly excited about her documentation, comparative analyses, correspondence with other scholars, detailed examinations of stitch techniques that revealed true modern origins. The effect of these words on Mrs. Davison was subtle but unmistakable. Her hand tightened on her needlework bag, and her carefully maintained composure showed the first hairline cracks of strain. Miss Marple continued her examination of the patterns, making increasingly specific observations about Mrs. Weatherby's research methods and her particular interest in cases where contemporary designs had been misrepresented as historical treasures. She mentioned having traced certain unique threads that served as signatures of particular artisans. Miss Marple added thoughtfully. Apparently, she had identified several instances where these distinctive materials had been used in pieces claimed to be much older than their actual creation. She called it her silver thread theory, the idea that certain modern materials would inevitably betray contemporary forgeries no matter how skillfully executed. Mrs. Davison rose abruptly, her movement sharp enough to disturb the carefully arranged pattern sheets. "I'm afraid I must be going, Miss Marple. This has been most illuminating, but I have other commitments this evening." As she gathered her belongings with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, Miss Marple made her final, carefully calculated observation. "Oh, Mrs. Davison, before you go, the vicar mentioned that Mrs. Weatherby had left sealed instructions about her research materials. Apparently, she arranged for everything to be forwarded to the Victoria and Albert Museum's textile department for proper scholarly review. Such foresight, don't you think? Her work will receive the attention it deserves, even though she's no longer here to see it published." The color drained entirely from Mrs. Davison's face, and for a moment she swayed slightly, gripping the back of her chair for support. The implication was clear. Mrs. Weatherby's research would continue beyond the grave, and any evidence of artistic fraud would eventually come to light through official channels that could not be influenced or suppressed. How wonderful for her legacy, Mrs. Davison managed, her voice barely above a whisper. as the afternoon shadows lengthened and Mrs. Davison departed with the careful steps of someone walking on treacherous ground. Miss Marple reflected on the successful conclusion of her psychological trap. The break-in had confirmed the killer's desperation. The waxed thread had provided physical evidence of their identity, and the revelation about ongoing scholarly review had delivered the final blow to their carefully constructed facade. The pattern was now complete, like a complex piece of needlework where every thread had found its proper place. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, when all pretense would be stripped away and the truth would emerge with the clarity that Miss Marple had always known it would. Mrs. Davison's careful planning had been undone by the very expertise she had tried so desperately to protect, and justice, like any well-executed design, would soon reveal itself in all its terrible symmetry. The dawn that followed Mrs. Davison's hasty departure brought with it the peculiar stillness that settles over a village when secrets are about to be exposed. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night contemplating the final threads of her investigation, made her way to the rectory with the purposeful step of someone who meant to weave those threads into an unbreakable pattern of truth. She had requested the use of the rectory parlour for what she described to the vicar as a small gathering to properly catalogue Mrs. Weatherby's needlework collection. The invitation list had been carefully considered. Dr. Haydock would attend as a friend of the family. Inspector Slack would arrive drawn by his natural suspicion of any gathering he had not organised. Mrs. Cross would come bearing her blue gloves and her guilty conscience, and Mrs. Davison would be summoned by an urgent message claiming that certain questions about Mrs. Weatherby's artistic research required her immediate expert attention. The parlour had been arranged with the careful precision of a stage set. The mahogany table bore Mrs. Weatherby's knitting basket, now returned by the police, alongside various pattern sheets and samples of her work. Miss Marple had positioned her own modest sewing basket nearby, its pale blue silk lining deliberately loosened to suggest the possibility of hidden compartments. Most significantly, she had requested that Emma Pratt bring a selection of her finest needlework tools, including the delicate instruments required for the most precise embroidery work. Mrs. Davison arrived precisely on time, her composure carefully maintained despite the obvious strain of the previous evening's revelations. She carried her familiar needlework bag and wore a high-necked blouse that concealed the base of her throat, as if protecting herself from the sort of wound she had inflicted on her victim. Miss Marple observed these details with the practiced eye of someone who understood that guilt often revealed itself through the very precautions taken to hide it. "How good of you to come, Mrs. Davison," Miss Marple said warmly, gesturing toward the display of needlework materials. "I'm afraid I find myself quite at a loss when it comes to the finer points of Mrs. Weatherby's techniques. Your expertise would be invaluable in ensuring that her work receives the proper scholarly attention it deserves." As the other participants gathered, Miss Marple began her careful orchestration of events. She drew attention to a section of silk lining that had come loose from her own basket, expressing concern about the proper method for making invisible repairs. "I never can manage the tension correctly," she confessed with the helpless air that elderly ladies adopt when seeking assistance. "Perhaps someone could demonstrate the proper technique?" Emma Pratt, ever practical, produced her collection of tools, fine needles, a cake of beeswax worn smooth by long use, and various threads suitable for delicate work. "You'll want to wax the thread," she observed cheerfully. "Otherwise it tangles something dreadful when you work it through silk." It was at this moment that Miss Marple's careful trap began to close. "Mrs. Davison handles such work so beautifully," she suggested innocently. "Would you be so kind as to show us the proper method? I noticed your technique at the fete, so precise and economical in its movements." Mrs. Davison's response was instinctive and revealing. Without conscious thought, she drew the thread across the beeswax with 3 practiced strokes, then reached for her needlework bag. Her hand emerged not with one of Emma's tools, but with her own bone-handled stiletto. the same instrument Miss Marple had observed during her previous visit. The movement was automatic, the gesture of someone for whom such tools were as natural as breathing. More tellingly still, Mrs. Davison began the delicate work with her left hand, steadying the fabric, while her right guided the stiletto, then unconsciously corrected herself, switching the positions as if remembering some social convention about proper-handedness. Dr. Haydock, watching with the trained eye of someone familiar with wounds and their creation, observed the angle and precision of her movements with growing alarm. "How very elegant," Miss Marple murmured, her mild tone masking the significance of what she had witnessed. "That particular angle, so precise, so economical. One would need considerable practice to achieve such accuracy, I imagine." As Mrs. Davison completed the demonstration, her movements growing more agitated under the weight of scrutiny, Miss Marple began her gentle exposition of the truth. "I've been thinking a great deal about Mrs. Weatherby's final research project," she said conversationally. "Her investigation into what she called artistic impropriety, the misrepresentation of contemporary needlework as historical family treasures." The effect of these words on Mrs. Davison was immediate and unmistakable. Her hand tightened on the stiletto, and her carefully maintained composure began to show hairline cracks of strain. Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness, describing Mrs. Weatherby's meticulous documentation, her correspondence with museum experts, and her particular interest in cases where modern materials had been used to create pieces claimed to be centuries old. She had developed what she called her silver thread theory, Miss Marple explained, producing a small sample of the distinctive embroidery floss that had been found caught in Mrs. Weatherby's wool. The idea that certain contemporary materials would inevitably betray modern forgeries no matter how skillfully they were executed or how elaborate their fabricated provenance. Mrs. Davison's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the full implications of Miss Marple's words became clear. The elderly detective continued her methodical revelation, describing how Mrs. Weatherby had stored her most damaging evidence in the secret compartment of her knitting basket, how the killer had approached under the pretense of admiring the prize cardigan, and how the confrontation had ended with a stiletto thrust delivered with surgical precision just beneath the victim's silver dove brooch. "The wound was made by someone left-handed," Miss Marple observed gently, "or by a right-handed person working from an awkward angle. Someone familiar with the precise application of sharp instruments to delicate materials. Someone who habitually waxed their thread for fine work, leaving traces of beeswax on everything they touched, including the scissors that were later planted to implicate poor Sandra Mills." Inspector Slack, who had been following this exposition with growing comprehension, finally found his voice. "Are you saying that Mrs. Davison—" His words were cut short by a sound that was neither cry nor word, but something between the two. Mrs. Davison's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled entirely, and she sank into her chair with the boneless collapse of someone whose strength has been utterly depleted. The stiletto fell from her nerveless fingers, its bone handle clicking against the mahogany table with the finality of a gavel. "She would have destroyed everything," Mrs. Davison whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the mantel clock. "My reputation, my work, my entire life's achievement. She had evidence, photographs, analysis, correspondence with experts who would have exposed every piece I had ever claimed as historical. I couldn't let her publish that research. I couldn't let her take away everything I'd worked so hard to build." The confession poured out in broken fragments. The discovery of Mrs. Weatherby's investigation, the desperate search for the damaging evidence, the moment of murderous opportunity when the competition results provided distraction, and the subsequent elaborate scheme to frame Sandra Mills for the crime. Each revelation confirmed Miss Marple's careful reconstruction of events, painting a picture of calculated desperation that had led inexorably to violence. As Inspector Slack took formal custody of both the confessor and the murder weapon, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Mrs. Davison's situation. A woman of genuine talent had destroyed herself to protect a reputation built on borrowed glory, choosing murder rather than face the consequences of her artistic dishonesty. The stiletto that had created such beautiful embroidery had become an instrument of death, wielded by hands that had forgotten the difference between creating beauty and destroying life. The rectory parlor gradually emptied as the participants departed to spread word of the resolution throughout Little Wickham. Miss Marple remained behind to tidy the needlework materials, handling each tool with the reverence due to instruments that could create such beauty when guided by honest hands. The pattern was complete now, every thread in its proper place, revealing not just the mechanics of murder, but the human weaknesses that had made it inevitable. Outside, the village bells began to chime the hour, their familiar cadence promising that life would continue despite the darkness that had briefly touched their peaceful community. Justice, like any well-executed piece of needlework, required patience and careful attention to detail, but once all the elements were properly arranged, the truth emerged with unmistakable clarity, beautiful in its symmetry, terrible in its implications, and final in its resolution. The hours that followed Mrs. Davison's confession unfolded with the peculiar mixture of relief and sorrow that settles over a community when a long-held deception has finally been exposed. Inspector Slack, his earlier bluster replaced by something approaching professional humility, supervised the necessary arrangements with uncharacteristic gentleness. Mrs. Davison, her carefully constructed facade now completely shattered, was led away with the broken dignity of someone whose entire life's work had been revealed as an elaborate lie built upon borrowed glory. Word of the resolution spread through Little Wickham with the speed that only shocking truth can achieve in a small village. The initial disbelief quickly transformed into a flurry of retrospective observations as neighbors recalled subtle signs they had previously dismissed. Mrs. Davison's nervous attention to her needlework bag, her particular interest in Mrs. Weatherby's research, the careful way she had positioned herself near the handicraft stall during those crucial moments at the fete. Every past interaction was now re-examined through the lens of revealed guilt, taking on sinister new meanings that had been invisible when viewed through the comfortable assumption of innocence. Sandra Mills returned from Bexford on the evening train, summoned by a carefully worded telegram from the vicar that assured her of complete vindication. She emerged from the railway carriage with the pale, uncertain air of someone who had spent days wrestling with the fear that her life had been irreparably damaged by circumstances beyond her control. The relief that washed over her was palpable, though tempered by the sobering knowledge of how close she had come to bearing the blame for a crime she had not committed. Her return to the library was met with genuine warmth from the community, who seemed eager to make amends for their earlier suspicions through small acts of kindness and renewed confidence in her abilities. Mr. Geoffrey Sims, who had endured the morning's revelations with the stoic resignation of a man facing long-postponed judgment, found himself in the unexpected position of receiving sympathy rather than condemnation. His minor financial transgression, once a source of overwhelming shame, now seemed insignificant compared to the larger tragedy that had unfolded. When he addressed the Women's Institute that evening, offering his resignation with genuine contrition, the motion to retain his services under careful supervision passed with surprising unanimity. Even Inspector Slack, lingering at the doorway, allowed himself a small nod of approval at this display of village justice tempered with mercy. Mrs. Cross suffered perhaps the most complex emotional aftermath, consumed by guilt over her unwitting complicity in the frame-up of an innocent woman. Her blue gardening gloves, once a symbol of respectability and careful standards, now seemed to mock her gullibility in believing Mrs. Davison's carefully crafted deceptions. Miss Marple, recognizing the woman's genuine remorse, made a point of visiting her cottage to offer the gentle absolution that only comes from someone who truly understands human frailty. "We all wish to believe the best of those we respect," she observed kindly. Mrs. Davison was very clever in presenting her request as a protection of community standards rather than a criminal conspiracy. The search of Mrs. Davison's cottage, conducted with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had learned to look beyond surface appearances, revealed the full extent of her artistic fraud. Folders of photographs clipped from museum catalogues, tracings on onion skin paper that mirrored celebrated historical motifs with only the most subtle alterations, and correspondence with distant relatives requesting family pieces for documentation, painted a picture of systematic deception spanning many years. In a drawer lined with lavender paper lay the damning evidence Miss Marple had suspected. A roll of waxed silver thread identical to the filament she had observed, and in a velvet case a second bone-handled stiletto to replace the one whose tip had been nicked during the commission of murder. Mrs. Briggs, exploring the order of the house she had maintained for 20 years, made a discovery that provided the final piece of the puzzle. Behind a row of hymnals on Mrs. Weatherby's escritoire lay a small notebook bound in black leather, filled with her neat handwriting documenting her private investigations into artistic fraud. The entries were methodical and devastating, with dates, initials, and actual samples of thread carefully pasted to the pages. Some entries bore decisive cross marks and words of exoneration for those who had satisfied her scrutiny. Others, including a detailed analysis marked ED, documented evidence of plagiarism with the clinical precision of a pathologist recording symptoms of disease. The notebook revealed Mrs. Weatherby's true nature. Not the vindictive busybody that some had imagined, but a woman driven by genuine passion for artistic integrity and historical accuracy. Her planned confrontation with Mrs. Davison had been intended as a private matter, offering the opportunity for graceful withdrawal rather than public humiliation. The tragedy lay in Mrs. Davison's inability to accept even private exposure, choosing violence rather than confession as her response to the threat of revealed deception. Mrs. Weatherby's memorial service, held 3 days later in the village church, drew the entire community together in a ceremony that was both tribute and catharsis. The vicar, speaking with unusual eloquence about the dangers of confusing righteous standards with merciless judgment, delivered a sermon that left the congregation thoughtful rather than comforted. The flowers were tastefully restrained, the music familiar and soothing, and the general atmosphere one of genuine respect for a woman whose rigid principles had ultimately cost her life. As the days passed and Little Wickham began the slow process of returning to its normal rhythms, Miss Marple prepared for her departure with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had been completed successfully. The village would heal, she knew, though it would carry forever the subtle awareness that even the most peaceful communities could harbor depths of ambition and desperation capable of transforming ordinary people into instruments of destruction. On her final evening at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple sat in the familiar comfort of the morning room, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm as she worked on the christening shawl that had occupied her attention throughout the investigation. The delicate pattern had grown considerably during her stay, its central motif, a simple lattice of interwoven diamonds, beginning to reveal the elegant design that had been present from the beginning, waiting patiently to emerge through careful, methodical work. "You knew very early, didn't you, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry asked with the tactless affection of old friendship. Miss Marple looked up from her work with a gentle smile. "One is seldom certain, my dear Dolly. One merely observes that human beings tend to repeat their patterns of behavior, just like the stitches in a piece of needlework. A person who cannot resist probing beneath the surface of a seam will not resist probing beneath the surface of a secret. Someone who takes what is not theirs in art will take what is not theirs in opportunity, and those who depend upon other people's silence always forget that silence, like fine thread, breaks at the slightest pressure." She returned to her knitting, the steady rhythm of her needles providing a soothing counterpoint to her words. "I am particularly glad about young Sandra. Youth should not be crushed beneath the weight of other people's ambitions and deceptions. As for Mrs. Davison, it is always tragic when genuine talent is corrupted by vanity and fear. Her needlework truly was exquisite, even if her claims about its historical provenance were false. The morning train carried Miss Marple back toward St. Mary Mead, her modest suitcase beside her in the completed section of christening shawl, carefully wrapped against soiling. As the familiar countryside slid past the window, well-tended fields, ancient hedgerows, and villages that looked much like Little Wickham in their peaceful prosperity, she reflected on the universal patterns of human nature that repeated themselves regardless of setting or circumstance. In her knitting bag, Mrs. Weatherby's black notebook lay safely wrapped, waiting to be forwarded to the Victoria and Albert Museum's textile department, where it would serve as a permanent resource for future scholars. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple that Mrs. Davison's crime had achieved precisely the opposite of its intended effect, ensuring that the evidence she had killed to suppress would survive for generations of researchers studying the authentication of historical needlework. The secret in the knitting basket had been revealed at last, its exposure costing 2 lives, one taken by violence, another destroyed by the consequences of that violence. But truth, like any well-executed pattern, had its own inevitable logic, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that patience and careful observation would always eventually reveal the design hidden beneath even the most elaborate deceptions. As Little Wickham disappeared behind the curve of the railway line, Miss Marple took up her needles once more and resumed her work on the christening shawl. There was something deeply satisfying about the honest creation of beauty through patient skill, she reflected. So different from the borrowed glory that had led Mrs. Davison to such desperate measures. In the end, authentic work always revealed itself, just as authentic character eventually emerged from beneath whatever masks people chose to wear. The train gathered speed toward St. Mary Mead, carrying Miss Marple home with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had once again proven that the most complex mysteries could be unraveled through careful attention to the small details that others overlooked. Human nature, she had learned, was indeed like a piece of needlework, seemingly simple on the surface, but revealing infinite complexity to those willing to examine it with patience, wisdom, and an understanding heart. The countryside rolled past Miss Marple's window with the gentle persistence of English seasons, each familiar field and hedgerow carrying her further from Little Wickham, yet deeper into contemplation of what she had witnessed there. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts as she worked methodically on the christening shawl, its delicate pattern emerging with the same patient inevitability that had revealed the truth behind Mrs. Weatherby's death. Her mind wandered over the curious human elements that had woven themselves into such a deadly design. Mrs. Davison, whose genuine artistic gifts had been corrupted by the desperate need to maintain a reputation built on borrowed glory, represented one of the most tragic forms of criminal Miss Marple had encountered. The woman's hands, so skilled at creating beauty with needles and thread, had been turned to destruction by pride and fear. A reminder that the same precision that could craft exquisite embroidery could also deliver a fatal wound with surgical accuracy. The train paused at a small country station, and Miss Marple observed a robin tugging triumphantly at a length of pale thread caught in the stationmaster's hedge. The silver filament flashed in the afternoon light, common enough modern fiber if one knew how to look, and the bird bore it away for nest lining with the practical satisfaction of a creature that found beauty in utility rather than pretense. Even borrowed materials, she reflected with quiet amusement, might serve an honest purpose when used without deception. News from Little Wickham arrived regularly over the following weeks, carried on the gentle network of correspondence that connected villages throughout the countryside. Mrs. Bantry's letters painted a picture of a community slowly healing from its wounds, though forever changed by what it had learned about the capacity for deception that could flourish beneath the most respectable facades. Sandra Mills had returned to her library duties with renewed confidence, supported by neighbors who seemed eager to atone for their earlier suspicions through small acts of kindness and renewed trust in her abilities. The Women's Institute had voted unanimously to fund an expansion of the library's needlework reference section, and Mrs. Weatherby's bequest had provided both a glass-fronted display case and a collection of authentic craft books. The new exhibition, organized with Sandra's careful attention to historical accuracy, featured honest labels that acknowledged uncertainty where provenance was unclear. Unknown artisan, reputed to be from Cornwall, or work of Mrs. Harris, mother of 9, as truthful as a well-kept ledger. The trial of Mrs. Davison, when it came, was conducted with the quiet dignity befitting a case where the central tragedy lay not in the crime itself, but in the circumstances that had made it seem inevitable to its perpetrator. Her defense counsel presented a picture of genuine talent corrupted by decades of increasing desperation to maintain false credentials, while the prosecution laid out Miss Marple's methodical reconstruction of events with clinical precision. Mrs. Davison herself appeared as a shadow of her former self, offering neither justification nor plea for mercy, but simply acknowledging the truth with the broken dignity of someone whose life's work had been revealed as elaborate fraud. The disposal of Mrs. Weatherby's estate provided its own form of justice. Her extensive research materials were donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where they formed the foundation of a new archive dedicated to textile authentication. The black notebook that had cost her life became a cornerstone of this collection, its methodical documentation serving as a permanent resource for scholars studying the complex relationship between artistic tradition and contemporary deception. In death, Mrs. Weatherby achieved the scholarly recognition that had eluded her in life, her work becoming a standard reference throughout the Commonwealth. Mrs. Cross, still struggling with guilt over her unwitting role in the conspiracy, found redemption through service, organizing a memorial garden behind the church filled with herbs and flowers traditionally used for creating natural dyes. The space became a quiet sanctuary for contemplation, a living reminder that beauty could emerge from tragedy when tended with patience and genuine care. Mr. Geoffrey Sims, his minor transgression now seeming almost quaint compared to the larger deceptions revealed, threw himself into community service with the fervor of someone seeking redemption through good works. His banking experience proved invaluable in reorganizing village funds and committees, and his obvious gratitude for the community's forgiveness gradually transformed him from awkward outsider into valued member of Little Wycombe's social fabric. A letter from the museum's textile department arrived at Miss Marple's cottage several weeks later, acknowledging receipt of Mrs. Weatherby's notebook with gratitude and requesting permission to consult her on points of local attribution. The young curator confessed to learning more from Mrs. Weatherby's methodical pages than from a term of lectures, a testament to the enduring value of careful observation over academic theory. As autumn settled over both St. Mary Mead and Little Wycombe, Miss Marple completed the christening shawl, blocking it with patient precision until the pattern revealed its quiet magnificence. She thought of Mrs. Davison, whose genuine gifts had been yoked to vanity until they dragged her where no talent should go, and of Sandra Mills teaching children to undo mistakes and begin again without shame. The contrast between honest creation and borrowed glory had never seemed more stark or more significant. The final letter from Mrs. Bantry captured the village's transformation with characteristic directness. "We are all rather more careful now, Jane, about the judgments we make and the secrets we keep. It's as if the whole business taught us that the patterns we think we see in people's lives may not be the patterns that actually exist. We look more closely now and listen more carefully, and I think we are better for it, though the lesson came at such a terrible price." Miss Marple, reading this in the familiar comfort of her sitting room, nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose work had achieved its intended purpose. The truth had been revealed, justice served, and a community forced to confront the uncomfortable realities that existed beneath even the most peaceful villages. It was, she reflected, as much as one could hope for in an imperfect world where the capacity for both creation and destruction often resided in the same hands. She wrapped the completed shawl in tissue paper, addressing it to a young mother in the neighboring village. A gift from someone who understood that honest creation of beauty was one of the few reliable antidotes to the deceptions and tragedies that seemed to weave themselves so persistently through human affairs. In the end, it was not the complexity of the pattern that mattered, but the integrity of the hands that created it and the love that guided every careful stitch toward its proper place in the larger design. Outside her window, the evening drew itself tidily about the cottages of St. Mary Mead and the familiar sounds of village life, the postman's final round, the calling of children to tea, the gentle closing of garden gates, provided their own quiet testimony to the enduring rhythms of ordinary existence. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, would continue to present its tangled knots and dropped stitches, but with careful attention and a steady hand, they could always be unraveled and put right. And that, she thought, as she settled her knitting in its basket, was a small but significant comfort in a world that too often mistook complexity for wisdom and deception for cleverness. The secret in the knitting basket had been revealed at last, its exposure costing 2 lives, one taken by violence, another destroyed by the consequences of that violence. But truth, like any well-executed pattern, had its own inevitable logic, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that patience and careful observation would always eventually reveal the design hidden beneath even the most elaborate deceptions. The weeks that followed Mrs. Davison's arrest brought a gentle settling to Little Wickham, like fabric relaxing after the tension of difficult stitches had been released. Miss Marple returned once more at Mrs. Bantry's invitation, arriving to find the village transformed not in appearance, but in understanding, the same cottages and gardens, but viewed now through eyes that had learned to look more carefully beneath familiar surfaces. The rectory parlor had been arranged for what Mrs. Bantry called a small ceremony of restoration, though the gathering felt more like a quiet acknowledgement that some things, once broken, could be mended with patience and goodwill. Inspector Slack appeared with something approaching humility, carrying a small wrapped package that he presented to Mrs. Briggs with uncharacteristic gentleness. "The silver scissors," he announced, his usual bluster replaced by careful formality. "Property of the estate, properly returned." The dove-engraved blades gleamed softly in their tissue wrapping, polished clean of the evidence they had once represented. "I should acknowledge," he continued with visible effort, "that my initial conclusions were premature. You have a way of noticing details, Miss Marple, that turn out to be rather more significant than they first appear." Miss Marple accepted this oblique apology with the gracious nod of someone who understood that pride, like fine fabric, required delicate handling when it came to repairs. "Most details are significant, Inspector, when viewed as part of the larger pattern. It simply requires patience to see how they fit together." Sandra Mills, who had returned to her library duties with renewed confidence, presented a modest display of Mrs. Weatherby's authentic needlework patterns, now properly documented and preserved for the community. Her earlier nervousness had been replaced by quiet dignity, and the villagers' treatment of her carried the subtle warmth of people seeking to make amends through small kindnesses. Mr. Sims, his minor transgression now seeming almost quaint compared to the larger deceptions revealed, had found purpose in reorganizing the village's various funds with meticulous honesty. As the gathering concluded and the participants began to disperse, Miss Marple produced a brown paper parcel that had traveled quietly from St. Mary Mead. She unwrapped the completed christening shawl, its delicate cream wool edged with a border of simple doves that seemed to float along its margin. The room made that small sound people make when something unexpectedly beautiful appears before them. It seemed a pity to let it sit unused, Miss Marple explained with characteristic practicality, "when there are children to be kept warm." The shawl's honest beauty stood in quiet contrast to the borrowed glory that had led to such tragedy, its every stitch placed with genuine skill rather than false claims. Mrs. Briggs touched the delicate border with reverent fingers. "What a comfort it is," she said softly, "to see work that is exactly what it claims to be." Several months later, an unexpected letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, bearing unfamiliar handwriting and a London postmark. The sender identified herself as Miss Catherine Davison, niece to the woman whose crime had so disrupted the village's peace. The letter was carefully composed, bearing the hallmarks of someone who had wrestled long with conscience before putting pen to paper. Miss Catherine wrote that she had been clearing her aunt's London lodgings when she discovered a locked trunk containing what appeared to be the authentic family needlework that Mrs. Davison had claimed as her own creation. The pieces were indeed historical treasures, passed down through generations of skilled craftswomen, but they had belonged to another branch of the family entirely, distant cousins whose line had died out during the Great War. "My aunt had inherited these pieces legitimately," the letter explained, "but somewhere along the way she began presenting them as her own creation rather than acknowledging them as family heirlooms. I believe the deception began small, perhaps a white lie to impress a judge at some long-ago competition, but once begun, it grew until she was trapped by her own fabrications. The irony is that she possessed genuine skill. Her own work, when I found examples of it, was quite beautiful in its own right." The revelation cast Mrs. Davison's tragedy in an even more poignant light. A woman of real talent who had destroyed herself to protect a reputation built on a foundation that was neither entirely false nor entirely her own. She had been both legitimate inheritor and fraudulent claimant, caught in the terrible middle ground between truth and deception that had ultimately led to murder. Miss Catherine's letter continued with a request that demonstrated the kind of moral courage her aunt had lacked. She wished to donate the authentic family pieces to the Victoria and Albert Museum's collection, properly attributed to their true creators, while establishing a small scholarship fund for young needlewomen who showed promise but lacked the means to develop their skills. "Perhaps," she wrote with touching hope, "some good might yet come from this terrible business." A year later, Miss Marple received an invitation to the opening of the Catherine Davison Memorial Collection at the museum. The exhibition made no attempt to disguise the complex circumstances that had brought the collection to light, instead using the story as a teaching moment about the importance of accurate attribution and the tragic consequences that could follow when artistic pride overcame scholarly honesty. The scholarship recipient's work, displayed alongside the historical treasures, showed the flowering of genuine talent nurtured through honest instruction and patient practice. As Miss Marple examined these displays of authentic craftsmanship, she reflected on the profound transformation that had emerged from tragedy. The young women whose work filled the scholarship cases would never need to choose between truth and reputation, having learned from the beginning that authentic skill was its own reward. They would create beauty without pretense, sign their names to their own work, and pass on their knowledge with the generous spirit that Mrs. Weatherby had tried, in her rigid way, to preserve. The secret in the knitting basket had indeed been revealed, but its exposure had led to something more valuable than mere justice. It had created opportunities for others to develop their talents without deception, to build reputations on genuine skill, and to contribute to the great tradition of craftwork that connected past and future through the simple act of creating beauty with one's own hands. On the train journey back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple took up her current project, a simple sampler for the village school, featuring traditional patterns that had been passed down through generations of honest needlewomen. Each stitch was placed with deliberate care, creating beauty through patient work rather than borrowed glory. The afternoon light slanted through the carriage window, illuminating the growing design with the same gentle clarity that had eventually revealed the truth about Mrs. Weatherby's death. In her small notebook, not the black one, which had gone on to its proper, useful future, but her own modest record of observations, she added a line no longer than a row of knit stitches. Vanity counts on secrecy. Integrity has no need of it. The pattern was complete at last, woven from threads of truth and justice, tragedy and redemption, creating a design that honored both the victims of deception and the beneficiaries of its ultimate exposure. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, would continue to present its tangled knots and dropped stitches, but with careful attention and patient hands, they could always be unraveled and put right. And that, she thought as she carefully folded her work, was perhaps the most comforting truth of all, that even from the darkest deceptions, honest beauty could eventually emerge, like light through carefully mended fabric, stronger and more precious for having been tested by adversity.